Sehr geehrte Damen und Herren,
Ladies and gentlemen, just in time, 12:50. We're starting into the second part of our symposium. This is item 3 and 4. We will start with cost and benefits. This is item number 3, starting with a presentation and going into the questions. I'd like to welcome Christiane Bannholzer from ÖBB. She's responsible for the DAC project there and will be giving the introductive presentation. Experts on the panel later on will be Matthias Knüppling from VTG and Dr. Jens Engelmann. He will have wearing a double head, so to speak, today as an expert. He will be trying to answer the questions that we will put up in the format that you've already grown accustomed to. Constanze, the floor is all yours. We're looking forward to your introductory presentations. Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues and dear listeners out there on the screens, I'm very happy to be able to be here. I mean, it's difficult times, but thanks to the appropriate COVID concept that we can stick to here, we can at least have a hybrid version of the seminar. I was already introduced, so I don't have to introduce myself. I would now like to ask the colleagues from technology to be so kind as to show you the first slide of my presentations. So the topic of my presentation will be costs and benefits. In the European DAC delivery program, we have one work stream which deals with that precisely. And it's also a good opportunity that today, thanks to the cooperation between VPI and ÖBB, we can present you the first preliminary results. The good thing, and let me go back to the presentations that we've had so far. It's very important that during the course of the symposium up to now, you have hopefully taken away that you cannot discuss any topic in isolation. Of course, in our projects, it's isolated work packages, but they're interconnected and there are interdependencies. In particular, when it comes to costs and benefits, all results from the different work packages are collected and then iteratively will finally lead to certain conclusions. We already heard from Armin Günther, for example, that when it comes to the DAC, we are not talking about an isolated solution, but we're talking about the doors it opens in terms of digitalization, automation, and the smart freight train of the future. Let me summarize a little. This is, of course, also the scope, the spectrum, the parameters that are being put into the concrete cost-benefit analysis. So DAC and the additional components gives us a possibility and enables us to make things smarter, to create additional infrastructure, to be more efficient and more intelligent. Also, when it comes to relationship with our clients, we are able to improve the service quality. And also when it comes to the competitiveness, we can have a positive advantage compared to road freight traffic, our biggest competitor. And we will be in a position to open up new markets. In the previous presentations, we concentrated very much on the workshops, but we must not also forget the people working in the shunting yards. So with the introduction of the DAC, we are, of course, make an improvement for health and safety at the workplace in daily operation. You might remember the picture of the shunting operator with his smear jacket, etc. And you should keep that in mind because it also plays an important part. What also must not be forgotten about is the value add that we create in the EU and also the positive contribution we make to the Green Deal. So via the smart capacity increase, the higher productivity, and also via making our customers having their goods transported on the rail and not on the road, we make, as I said, an enormous contribution to reduce emissions and the Green Deal.
So, ich klicke jetzt auf die nächste Folie.
Next slide. Okay. Let's have a look at how cost-benefit is being looked at in our CBA. I mean, the core component is our Cba Calculator. Now, this gives you a very abstract view of that. And there are different sources, but on the left-hand side, you can see the direct benefit. And the direct benefit can come from the application of different functionalities with a technical component as a basis. And inside this model that we defined and which we are currently continuing to develop, this can happen in shunting, in train preparation, in the train run, but also in maintenance. So we discussed the different benefits in the previous presentations, but let me make this very clear. The benefit is, of course, different for the different stakeholders. For example, we have the RUs, the infrastructure managers, but we also have our customers or the wagon holders who also can generate an added benefit. Talking about, we heard about the use cases from Armin Günther when it comes to reliability and flexibility. Of course, there is also a positive benefit which is taken into consideration with this model. Macroeconomic assumptions. We don't live on an island, right? We are not at T0. We have an existing system which has to be transformed. So all that is relevant in that context is to take into consideration, as it is with regard to BIP, growth assumptions or inflation assumptions. Now, these are general factors that play a role here, but also sector-specific things come in. Of course, the Sustainable Smart Mobility Strategy is only an ambition, mind you. I mean, it's talked about a lot, but it's only an ambition, so it's important also to use different data, such as the ITF Transport Outlook published by the OECD, which anticipates the rail freight traffic development until 2050, for example. So when it comes to the model, we use different data sources. Now, when it comes to the benefit, don't worry, I will not talk about benefit also. I will also mention the cost. So, for example, what comes in here is the modal shift potential, for example, from the road to the rail, which, of course, where externalities come in, where we can make a positive contribution in the context of the Green Deal, and where also HSE plays an important role. You can't put a monetary value to that, of course, but it has to be taken into consideration. The direct costs, of course, DAC deployment. Costs have to be compared to the benefits here, and, as we already heard repeatedly, also the additional automation components are a cost factor. I will mention some of them later on, just very briefly. Also, we should not forget about the legal background. We already heard a bit about legal basis and legal rules. So this DAC is not only relevant for the sector, but it also happens in the framework of legal rules that we have to fulfill. So once a technical specification in TDI, this is when it comes to interoperability or WAG, an economic consideration of the selected technology has to happen together with ERA. So the agency is also included in the European DAC delivery program. We also cooperate closely with the Commission. Now, this is an abstract and very simplified picture of the parameters that are being taken into consideration and go into the cost-benefit calculator. Of course, there are many more details, but we are currently in the process of developing this further, hopefully finalize this fairly soon, so I will not be able to give you some final results and conclusions, but some introductory remarks on what we're doing and where we are. Right, in the next step, let us have a look at several processes, part processes in freight traffic transport modes. Why is that? Because we also differentiate between different modes of traffics in when it comes to costs and benefits. I'm still fairly young. I'm fairly new, but it's still interesting to realize how often digital coupling, automatic coupling, this is being used in wagon load traffic. Actually, what is actually the benefit for other operations? Well, shunting takes place everywhere. Perhaps more so for wagon load traffic, but also when it comes for block train and also in intermodal or combined traffics. So that's the first thing, and let me make this very clear. And then also, I'd like to say that the DAC is not an independent technology, but an enabler for further digitalization and automation. So the intermodal traffic, we can look at the intermodal traffic, at the block trains, etc., and think back to what Armin Günther explained. The block train will be driving on a track which has a level 3 system and where an inherent train integrity monitoring will have to take place. So this should remind us of the fact that this has a benefit for all modes of transport and all types of train traffic. Okay. So it's important that I give you an idea of the use cases which form the basic structure for the current cost-benefit analysis. So it's all about functionality. A certain functionality is to be achieved on the basis of a certain technology. It can be the digital automated coupling or additional components. So this functionality is applied to a train process. We had the Cba Calculator with a direct benefit. So this has a positive impact then on, for example, the shunting performance, the train run, the train preparation, etc. So, and of course, it also generates costs for the different components, for the different process steps, and this has then been compared with each other. What is important, and I will not go into the individual use cases, but the decision and this step that we greatly supported as ÖBB in the framework of the European DAC delivery program is that as a sector, we agree on a framework, on a scope of automation components that we will need in the future in rail traffic, freight rail traffic, that have a connection with the DAC and that can be introduced in a simplified and standardized fashion. And this is the scope that also is taken into consideration in the cost-benefit analysis. So these are the use cases that are being reviewed. And when it comes to the output then, which we will hopefully be able to deliver fairly soon, namely to answer the question, which technology package, which use case are to be deployed. So this is why it's important that I gave you this slide. I don't go into the details. We got the coupling, we got the brake test. A brake test takes between 15 to 45 minutes. So for a train that is being idle for 24 hours, for example. So when it comes to the time component, there's enormous savings potential. Train integrity, we don't have to go into this in every detail, but we need an integrated train integrity test. Also, we have an infrastructure-based integrity test. So we do not only have an improvement that axle counters, for example, and other infrastructure can be removed. So all of this is a package that comes in here when it comes to calculating cost and benefit. And in the future, then once we've done all of that, we can come up with a conclusion on the different packages. What can I tell you about the status quo of the CBA cost-benefit analysis as of today? First of all, what is the starting point? The current time spent in hours depending on the place. So this is the actual situation that we considered for our use cases. So this is the situation we have now, and not what we have to want in the future. So we had interviews with different stakeholders on the basis of the expert analysis. We have consistent results with an eye on the agenda. I can't give you too many details, but of course we had to look at different preparations, be it the sidings for intermodal traffic, large or small shunting yards, etc. And we can see that for different processes, for different clusters, a lot of time is being spent. And what is actually the core message? So duck only in the orange, you see shunting activities. So compared to the other blocks, it looks minor, but it still has to be taken into consideration. And we know that a lot of time is spent here, which can be reduced with the application of the DIC. But I would like to make you even more aware of the additional automation components and the realization of the additional use cases. So this is the central potential. Now, no matter as to whether we pre-install everything and then install different components step by steps later on when it comes to migration, or whether we choose a different migration path, but as a sector, as an industry, we have to take the long-term perspective. So we see how much time is being spent currently. So we also see that it's an enormous potential if you reduce only part of that. For example, 6 million hours per year on a European scale for the large shunting yards. I don't want you to start calculating how many people you can save. This is, not the case, because what we're offering to the policymakers is a comprehensive offer, which means that we make capacity and transformation potential available as an industry. Now, the interim conclusion, which is my final conclusion as of today, is that the data collection on costs and benefits is well advanced, but not finished yet. For example, when it comes to migration, what we discussed earlier, and also we are still currently doing a study on the effects of level 3 in order to be able to include this in the calculation. What is important, and I'm repeating myself, but a driver for considerable time spent savings are automation, additional automation components, and every train system will benefit. We're not talking about the former incumbents again, but all of the players. So everyone will generate a benefit, so it will benefit the entire sector of industry. Okay, what are the next steps that we plan for? In the second quarter of 22, we want to do a sector consultation for the CBA, which means we're not working in a vacuum. But the results that we are generating are to be presented to the sector for validation and challenge. It is a highly complex matter, so we will always try to get feedback from the sector. So much from me. But let me also make a personal statement. We do assume that the market share of rail traffic or rail freight traffic is to increase. And I believe that with this initiative that includes so many players, we also provide a tool to create better quality, productivity, slower transport times, etc., which our customers then can use to go for rail traffic, more so than for road traffic. I mean, that's the only way forward. And I'd like to thank you for your attention.
Vielen Dank, Constanze Ban.
Thank you very much, Ms. Banholzer. This presentation once again brought it home to us quite acutely that DAC is needed. We need to make this innovative leap. But, I think another interesting aspect is the costs associated with it. And this is the subject of this panel. So what will be the cost associated with the introduction of DAC? Here is a question from the Pro Rail Alliance and from our French colleagues, all of who are interested in what will be the bill to be paid associated with the DAC. I'd like to try and summarize the question. It's about a price tag. So what will be the large series cost for the conversion of a 4-axle wagon to make it DAC ready? And what will be the cost in terms of additional working hours, which is already a DAC ready? Matthias, would you like to answer? Of course, I think it's a good thing that we should be discussing costs right at the beginning and focus on the benefits more comprehensively afterwards. In terms of costs, we are looking at the study from the ministry. We've already looked at what EDTP has come up with in terms of figures, but for the time being, we are looking at the costs that were derived from the ministry study. 10,000 euros for the coupling, 2,500 euros for the conversion proper, and depending on the automation components, you would have to pay another 5,000 euros. So all in all, this adds up to 17,500 euros, which is just 50% of what you would have to pay for a new buffer stop or stop block. Even though, lower costs have been mentioned for the buffer stops. Now, what's the impact on working hours? Well, if we assume that DAC readiness can be achieved during scheduled maintenance and service works at the workshop site, and assuming that we have a plug-and-play solution, we are hoping that, it can be taken care of within 2.5 hours per wagon. So conversion to be handled within 2.5 hours. Thank you very much. That's the costs and working hours in a nutshell. So 17,500 euros per wagon, and looking at an overall fleet size and adding the engines, we would probably end up with 10 billion euros. That's going to be the total cost. So where is this money going to come from? Well, we will look at that in the last block 4 later on. For the time being, I would like to try and answer another question that we've received. It's also a question submitted by the Pro Rail Alliance. It's to do with the additional costs compared to the standard costs of a screw coupler wagon. Is it 7,500? Exactly. 7,000, that's relevant for a new build where the buffers and the coupling can be deducted, making it little less costly. 10,000, that's the amount to be estimated for the coupling itself, and in terms of new builds you can save some of these costs and deduct a number of items. But 7,000, that's the rule of thumb for new builds, and 10,000 euros if you want to convert an existing wagon. Okay, let's talk about the total fleet size. Jens Engelmann, how many freight wagons do we have in the European Union? That's also a question submitted by the ProRail Alliance. Counting wagons is a pretty complex exercise, but if you want to do a rough cost estimate, you better calculate the numbers correctly. Well, we cannot give you a 100% correct figure. However, if we assume 560,000 vehicle or cars, which is the figure that we've derived from the ministry's study, so 450,000 freight wagons, even though there's people who say that it may be down to 330,000. We don't quite know, but it's going to be in that order of magnitude. You know, plus minus 100,000 can make a pretty substantial difference, though. And if I may add, I fully agree with what my colleague Matthias just said. Matthias Knüppling, we always have to estimate target costs. You know, these are target costs that you've stated, and we can only hope that the manufacturers will actually comply with that, you know, and manage to stay within this cost frame. Because if we were to end up, you know, at 7,000 instead of 5,000 for a coupling, which may well happen, that would be difficult. You know, we don't quite know whether these figures can be complied with, but we have to use some figure, you know, just for operational purposes. So please don't be surprised if the costs are higher or lower than currently estimated. It is a work in progress after all. Now, looking at the total number of wagons, we also know that the effects of the DAC conversion will take a toll, you know, everywhere across the board, especially in single wagon load operations. And here is a question on that. So how many of these wagons are used as single wagon load cars, and what's the situation there? Now, let's remind everybody that we don't have any reliable figures for the conversion of the total fleet. We can only give you percentage figures and try to break that down for the individual wagons. Also, you need to bear in mind that, you know, there's different conditions in the different countries within Europe. Now, for the Austrian market, and from the point of view of the OBB, Rail Cargo Group, and we've listened to Stefan Luig, who is one of our colleagues. So for the Austrian rail operators, I can tell you that a single wagon load freight amounts to 50% of our total operations. And this means that in Austria, we certainly will be creating a backbone for the manufacturing industry. So in Germany, I think the percentage figure is 40%. It may be different in other countries, but this is approximately, you know, the share of single wagon load cars in the respective countries. What about total costs? Mr. Lennart, can I ask you to read out that question, because that's a question of the total funding required. Mr. Lennart, here's the question. What is the total funding required for the conversion? And what about, you know, any upfront activities to obtain funding? Well, the figures that we've heard so far, if you add these numbers up, you will end up with 10 to 12 billion euros to convert the wagons, the engines, the locomotives, some of the parts of the infrastructure. As regards public funding, well, I would like to motivate all of you out there, ladies and gentlemen, to keep focusing on that, and please stay tuned, because in the fourth block we will be talking about funding solutions, so stay tuned, as they say. Sorry, I was also going to add something here, because, the temporary information that I've given you can only be temporary. This is work in progress. We're constantly trying to fine-tune the figures. That's important for me to tell you once again, because, we've done studies in the past and we are trying to refine these studies all the time. And that's why you need to know that the figures I've given you, are not, cast in stone. This is work in progress and the figures may still change as things develop. Here's a question from VDB, German Railway Industry Associations. Mr. Perry, can I ask you to please read out the question from VDB? Now, you mentioned 30%. That's a figure that's communicated both from Berlin and from Brussels too. And the VDB would like to know the following. How can DAC, the digital automatic coupling, contribute, to reach this 30% target? And is it possible to achieve this target without the DAC at all? Well, answer, in the sector, there's a lot of, improvement underway to improve the overall environmental performance of rail freight traffic. However, if you listen to the voices coming out from inside the sector, everybody agrees that without the DAC, we're not going to get anywhere. DAC is the way forward if the sector is to improve its performance. So we need the DAC. And you are speaking about the sustainability and smart mobility strategy. Well, we want to see a 100% increase here over the next few years, which means that we as a sector have to do our homework. And, incremental change, that's a concept of the past. Now is the time for a fundamental transformation. And everybody has, contributed so far. The research institutions, the railway operators, etc. So your work is appreciated a lot because, otherwise we wouldn't have come so far. I would also like to add that no matter whether you talk about 25% market share in Germany or the 30% stipulated by the EU, we're not going to get to either of these figures without DAC, and that's why we are pushing it so hard. Now, there's a question from the NEE Association to do with technological issues. Mr. Wessinghaus, would you please read out that question? Here's the question. What are the most important technologies enabled by DAC? And in your mind, what are the low-hanging fruits, the targets that can be achieved in a timely fashion? Okay, I'd like to answer that. Well, we have discussed the technologies at great length. It's about the EP, the electric pneumatic brake. It's the brake tests. So, the low-hanging fruits. Which of these fruits are the low-hanging ones? Well, low-hanging fruits, that's the targets that can be achieved with a considerable effect within a short time. So the slow increase over many, many years won't get us anywhere because you will be waiting for the effects forever on end. And that's why I am arguing a lot, in favor of a quick transformation, a quick conversion. This will allow you to reap the low-hanging fruits quickly. So let's do this conversion quickly. If we manage in single wagon load freight to convert the core network quickly, we stand a chance of reaping benefits quickly. Whether it's low-hanging fruits, well, that is a matter of interpretation. But, if we do things quickly, we won't have to wait forever on end for things to change for the better. Okay, let's continue with the questions we've received. Let's talk about, HSE and the working environment in general. We've received a lot of questions. VDB has submitted the following question on the working environment. Mr. Perra, what's the question? Now, that's a question from VDB. How does DAC contribute to a safe and efficient working environment? Because so far, there's a lot of, hard and manual work in terms of screwing the spindle and coupling, which is not happening only at the shunting stations, but wherever wagons are separated and joined. And it's, to do with a chassis, it's to do with the demographic change, which is also an impact on the shortage of skilled workers. Well, I'd like to answer on a positive note, says Constanze Bernholzer. We all remember this, image of the worker with grease on his gear, working in the burned rectangle. Now, I haven't been with the rail industry for so long, but still I am acutely aware of the accidents that can occur, especially during shunting. And this goes to show that with the DAC, with the technological solutions and everything that comes with it, I think it's fair to say that we can make daily working lives for our shunting staff easier. People won't have to lift these 20-kilogram objects anymore. So that's a positive contribution, across the board, wherever you look. That's true, and also when it comes to demographic change, it's going to be more and more difficult to find suitable workers who are prepared to do this kind of work, being out there in all kinds of weather. That's true, and we will also have to keep developing our job models, and once we see that there's recruitment difficulties, it will still be possible, to adjust the tasks. And with this kind of technical solution, with this digital solution, I think we have an asset that will make us a more attractive employer. So digitalization will help us become a more interesting and more attractive employer for future talents. So, the DAC will also be an investment in our human resources. In terms of job models, let's talk about maintenance and service for a minute. Not only during the OEM stage, but, I've heard the job title wagon mechatronic. I've come across this term, and, that's perhaps a career path that may be more interesting for interested people. People won't have to do welding and fitting works only, but, the job description will be expanded, digital elements will be added. So, it will become more diverse, which will make it a more interesting prospect for young talents, graduates. Okay, let's move on to a question from VDB. It is on intermodal networking. It's question 405, Mr. Perai. Can we have that question, please? Now, we've spent some time working about the tough manual labor that the shunting staff have to do. It's the wagon and technical inspections, the shunting maneuvers. So the question is, how can more standardization help make shunting operations more flexible? It's not only about a savings potential, but, there's also other opportunities to be achieved. So perhaps you can tell us more about that. Now, of course, we could look at each and every use case, but I don't even want to do that. I'd rather like to try and answer as follows. In terms of brake tests, 15 to 25 minutes can be saved by having a digitized technical component such as the DAC. So that's an enormous time-saving potential. And that's just one example. What about intermodality? VDB goes on asking what, intermodality networking possibilities are there. What about interfaces to urban logistics by having intermodal transshipment terminals? I mean, these are pretty, comprehensive tasks. Great. Finally, we are looking at things from the customer's point of view. Now, digitization is key, is the precondition for everything else that is to happen. When Armin Günther spoke this morning, we learned something about added services in terms of load and cargo monitoring. What is the state of the cargo in transit? What about customer interfaces? What about the supply chain? We tend to have some knowledge gaps in the supply chain, and by establishing the DAC, we'll be able to do away with that. We'll be able to see what products are transported at any time. And in terms of condition-based maintenance, we stand to benefit a lot too from the introduction of the DAC. But perhaps most importantly, digitally supporting transport and cargo flows. That's the most important thing for our customers, and this won't work without the D in a DAC. Okay, thank you very much. Let's focus on the digital aspects. The digital automatic coupler will generate a host of data. How are we going to deal with these data? It's an important issue. Perhaps you can briefly comment on that before we conclude this block. Now, we are only at the very beginning in terms of data management. We have focused on the technical solutions, which has yet to be finalized. However, what we do know is that data security has to be guaranteed, especially when it comes to sensitive data. All the data to do with the train, in terms of train integrity, we need to make sure that all of this happens in a safe way. Operationally speaking, that's the two key aspects we're currently focusing on. So it's also work in progress? Yes. Okay, we are looking forward to EDTP keeping us in the loop about data-related questions. There's one final question from the ProRail Alliance, and that, if it's okay with you, I'd like to conclude this block. Calculation of profitability. So how can we calculate whether a DAC makes economic sense? Well, first, of course, depending on the number of couplings or ton kilometers, and what about, the profitability across the entire European cargo wagon fleet. Now, why are you looking at me? Well, I'll try and answer. It's, a piece of information that seems to be of great interest to many of you, and I think it would be a good idea to have Mr. Jens Engelmann to try and respond to this question, because I have already done so. Okay, we saw that on one of Ms. Banholz's charts. There's the cost-benefit chart, if you remember. But this chart is not complete yet, because, after all, we are trying to work out a pan-European type of business. How many wagons are moving from A to B, across what borders, etc., what train blocks are concerned, and what's the cost share of each of these subsystems. So you all know how difficult it is to break down the available tonnage to the number of trains, etc., how much has to be allocated to the sidings, and how do we extrapolate that to the number of couplings. Very tricky. But once you manage to solve this equation, you will end up with the user benefit. It's a matter of the train formation, frequencies, the number of couplings in the shunting stations. We have received initial results already, and on top of that, you need to consider the capacity to be created additionally in order to live up to the Green Deal targets. So, we are currently trying to work that out. The values for level 3 have been put together. And, all I can say for the time being is that the figures that are available to date are not sufficiently reliable. That's why I cannot give you any binding figures. Now, as Mr. Behrens this morning said, and I can only agree with that, we are still lacking data. Please do provide us with reliable data. Otherwise, we can only operate based on estimates, and that's not good enough. The more we know what is happening out there, the better our results will be. So I'd like to encourage all of you once again to please, give us as much information as you can. And that's a call I can only reiterate. It's a sectoral effort. We've heard it before, and I can only highlight this once again. Okay. Thank you very much. I'd like to conclude this panel and move on to the very interesting question of who's going to foot the bill and how will everything be funded. I would like to thank the current panelists and ask the new panelists to come to the stage.
Ja, der Block Finanzierung.
Right, financing is the next item on the agenda.
Und wir haben gerade
Someone has to foot the bill. And we heard figures ranging between 10 to 12 billion euros, and that's a lot of money. But I believe if we manage to raise it, it will be well invested, because the increase in freight traffic cannot be done via the road. So we have to have competitive rail freight traffic. And we can also, and in order to do this, we need the DAC. So let's have a look at financing. Professor Stefan Bull is the head of department of the Federal Ministry of Transport and Digital Infrastructure. So he will give us some input on financing. And after that, there will be Mr. Carsten Schering from TWA and Mr. Gilles Peterhans, General Secretary of UIP, who is in the Supervisory Board of EDDP, and will be heading the working package number 8 very soon. Mr. Bull, the floor is all yours. Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here today. Congratulations on the organizers, to the organizers. I'm also happy to be here, and particularly happy to be here because the discussion with regard to the first 3 items on the agenda shows one thing amongst others that might be surprising you, but as a representative of a ministry, it's actually beautiful to see how this topic has developed over the last few years. Thinking 4 to 5 years back, when the debate started, actually the ministry and myself were instrumental in bringing this about. So the input came from the ministry. And then we had a migration study. Mr. Hagen responsible for this. This was also mandated by the ministry. And actually it also triggered a considerable dialogue in the sector. And being here today, we see a result of that. And we can be nothing but happy about this. So all of you out there watching and thinking back to how you saw the meta-enter topic 4 to 5 years ago, I believe we made considerable progress, and I thank everybody for organizing this symposium today. So, who is to foot the bill? This is a question which certainly not only the experts here in the room have been asking themselves for months and years, but also those of you who are watching out there today who might be thinking about this for the first time. We're talking about migration. We're talking about the question as to how we get this technology into the market. We're talking about costs. We're talking about benefits. And at the end of the day, everybody in the sector will look at the bottom line. They will calculate things and also ask themselves, what's in it for me? as an entrepreneur who also wants to earn money, and what do I have to pay? And in the first instance, people might think, well, how is this going to work? Because the costs, at first glance, seem to be much higher than the benefit. I will not be able to answer this question today. Who will foot the bill? But I can take you along and give you an idea of the discussion that's going on at the moment. And when I went through my own charts, I realized that it might be a bit of a preempted summary of the last three panels, because everything we heard at the last three panels actually feeds into the discussion as to who foots the bill, who pays for this. And I tell you straight away, this debate is ongoing. It has to be ongoing. And in order to come up with a positive end, a positive final point, we need your input, experts in the room, everyone out there, the industry, and also the ministry. Politics will have to drive this discussion. A starting point when talking about financing is also the large consensus, hopefully here in this room and hopefully amongst most of those who are online today, that DAC, that the digital automatic coupler, is the key technology in Europe in order to make rail freight traffic more efficient, more competitive, productive, etc. The increased competitiveness, which actually is to the benefit of everyone in the sector. So it is in the very entrepreneurial interest to make sure that DAC happens. So to be able to make this a fruitful debate and to come up with a good result, what we also need for that debate is a political consensus, political tailwind on a national level and at the European level. So for those of us who drive this topic in the ministries, it is very, very important that the new federal government in Germany, that the parties of this coalition introduced a decisive sentence in the coalition agreement that they want to go for the DAC and that they want to speed up the introduction in Europe. Well, some of you here in the room and out there might say, hey, listen, let's employ this at all. And now the politicians even want to speed that up. But all those who have all taken any entrepreneurial decision know that you have to be ambitious, that you have to set targets, that you have to get going. And for you, for us, for this entire debate, this one sentence on a national scale is a massive tailwind. At the same time, we do know, and this is also something that comes out of the first three panels, the introduction of a DAC only makes sense at a European scale. There will, an isolated introduction in just some countries will not work. We have to have a pan-European approach. Looking into the faces here in the room, it's a truism, of course, but it has consequences when we talk about financing, because where do we talk about financing? Where do we have to talk about financing is at the European scale. This is where it has to happen. One country alone cannot drive this. We have to have this debate at a European level. Well, we're not starting from scratch. In 2020, Germany had the presidency of the European Council, where all the member states actually already looked into DAC, and this is already a major achievement. The former Transport Minister, Mr. Scheuer, introduced people to an online conference during which people dealt with rail freight traffic only, exclusively, and as a result we had the so-called Berlin Declaration. Part of the content was also the European corridors, rail freight corridors, but also the DAC. And 28 member states in Europe said that they want to introduce DAC in Europe. This consensus must not be underestimated because, of course, it is also the starting point for the financing debate that we are now having. And it's of considerable value in that debate. Now, we already looked into it when we talked about costs and benefit. The question is, how much will it be? What are the costs? Now, as a federal ministry, we refer to the study that was mandated by us. Of course, what else would we refer to? And on the basis of this, the cost for EU migration are about between 6.4 and 8.6 billion. And the author of the study would clearly say this is an estimate. It always depends. It depends on different parameters. For example, how many wagons are we talking about? Which network are we talking about? What is the technology that we want to go for, etc. Now, this brings me to another item which will also play a role when it comes to cost, namely the technology that we go for. What type of technology do we go for? Which type of DAC do we want to implement? So currently the experts are going for type 4 and are concentrating on type 4, which is currently being tested. Of course, it's supposed to be upwards compatible. But we also know, and this is what the experts are telling us, once we go to the next high level, and we also heard this today, we are not only talking about technology, data, etc., we are also discussing a much higher level of cost. Let me mention the DAC demonstrator at this juncture. Why does this demonstrator play an important part when it comes to financing? Well, of course, because it's being supported by my ministry and it also was initiated there, but it also has to be mentioned because we are now at the point where we have not only chosen the Scharfenberg coupler, which is a major success and was a result of this demonstrator, also because it shows that something that is done at a national level can be transposed, so to speak, to a European level with the pressure that was put into that. And this DAC demonstrator is also an ambassador because, once the train started, so to speak, and we have already seen which countries the demonstrator train is to go through, this will lead to initiate a discussion on DAC, migration and financing in those countries. Now later, when it comes to the question and answers, we might also be discussing the question how the individual national state, the ministries that we are in contact with, are positioning themselves. And the DAC demonstrator is a good starting point, not only to talk about technical questions, not only to discuss infrastructure, etc., but also to discuss financing. Now, let's have a look at the discussion that's going on at the European level. So there's not a lot of new things on this slide. Perhaps we should go to the middle, and then I'd like to focus on that. The discussion on financing is had via the EDGP, no longer Shift to Rail, but the follow-up organization it is. And this is the right place for it to happen, because this is where all people meet. The nation states are around the table, the representatives of the rail freight traffic sector are around the table, representatives from the member states are around the table, and also the European Commission is to be found there. At the end of the day, the question of financing will be answered by European policy decision makers. That is the Commission and also by the Council, the representatives of the 28 member states, because we need the 28 member states, which at the end of the day have to earmark budgets for an independent European financing program. We are still very much at the beginning of this debate. we are very much in favor of an independent financing program, which would be the first important pillar. There are also some approaches here, for example, FC. Now, if you look at the total financing costs that will have to be covered, it's not so much, perhaps it's 300 to 400 million euros, but once DAC is ready, when it comes to research and development, money will be provided. But it's a first step. It shows that the topic, when it comes to financing instruments that already exist, that this topic is already on the table. We are also discussing the Green Deal and the money available there. We're talking about European monies available from fighting the economic effects of the corona pandemic and the outflow of that. So all of this is on the table, but at the end of the day, we will certainly have to come up with an independent financing program at a European level. The Commission is still fairly skeptical, at least as we experience that. But also with other member states, we will certainly have to do a lot of advertising, because there are some people who don't know too much about freight traffic. And we have to position the topic appropriately and make sure that funding is available. Now, one aspect which we have to focus more on is that it's not only about the modernization of rail freight traffic, but it's also about industry policy. And I think this is actually the starting point also for larger member states to drive the discussion, that it's always also funding for the industry as a whole. This gets me to the second pillar of financing. This is the national states. Honestly, things are still in its infancies, also in Germany. As a ministry representative, I have no way to assess what this sentence that I mentioned in the coalition agreement will mean in the last analysis, what effect it will have. Of course, we must not forget that we do have to prove that it works technically, so we have to make sure that the discussion is being had in the proper sequence. We have to document that it works technically. We have to show that it has a real benefit. We have to show that the migration can work. And then we have the proper arguments to take things to the national level in order to get additional funding. But when it comes to Germany, it will also be a difficult discussion, because the consolidation of the federal budget after the pandemic will be massive. Massive. This coalition, this federal government wants to go back to sticking to the debt cap as of 2023. So this will have a massive impact. And this gets us to the third pillar. And this is the sector itself. I do understand that, I've been working for ministry for quite some time, and I follow and participate in various discussions, and I do understand that the sector, once people get down to the very own arithmetics and make up the very own calculations, the sector comes up with a demand that the state has to pay for everything. Everything has to be funded by public means. I dare to say today that this will not happen. I cannot exclude this, of course, and I'm not allowed to exclude this as an employee of a ministry. It's a political decision as to whether there will be 100% public funding. But if you ask me for my experience and my gut feelings, there will be no 100% funding. It will rather be the three pillars, as it is being discussed in EDTP. And there is a reason for that, why the sector should invest itself and can invest itself, because actually you are reaping the benefits. So you will harvest efficiency. So in the last analysis, all three pillars have to be there and have to participate and join in. Now, looking forward, the financing concept has to be finalized very quickly. You can, of course, refer to studies, etc., but when it comes to getting everyone in the boat on the European level, you need the financing concept, also based on the cost-benefit analysis that we just heard about. And once we have this financing concept, end of 2022, beginning of 2023 might be, that's what we hear, then hopefully the discussion will gain momentum. If you ask me for my wish, as a representative of the technical level of a ministry, I reckon that this discussion will be had at the national level and the EU level, and it will gain momentum because we will then have a sound basis on which we can really discuss things in greater detail. What is important, no matter what discussion we're having, there are parallel discussions, and in the future there will be parallel discussions, but what's important that we have a joint aim, so that we want to complete the major part of the migration by 2030. And again, there will have to be a big exclamation mark also when we talk about financing, because at one point or other the debate has to come to an end and to a conclusion. So much on the debate that's going on so far, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you very much. And I would like Mr. Carsten Schering and Mr. Peter Hans to come to the panel so that we can go into the finance debate. And apart from the questions that I have on my paper, let me have a starting question. How can we get back to the 100% public funding?
Die erste Frage, die schwierigste.
Thank you very much, Malte. First question, most difficult question. Thanks for asking it. Well, I remember, we discussed that on a rather polemical note with Mr. Bull yesterday. One thing is sure. We need to remove the legal barriers to 100% funding. This needs to be done away with. Because, this is what all the ministries in all countries use as the excuse. I cannot do it. There's a legal requirement which forbids me to do this or that. So we need to do away with the legal barriers first. And second, as a sector, we need to speak with one voice. We need to clearly communicate one message. And here we have still a lot of room for improvement. Whenever we talk of funding, Mr. Bull may have a different opinion from me. He may not quite know what needs to be funded. And that's why I would like to phrase the question as follows. It's not a question of whether something needs to be funded, but why we need funding. And, we haven't managed to answer that question yet. The future is all about putting transport on the rail. And that's what is the title of our event here today. In all member states, all across Europe, there are countries which have invested in rail operations, in rail freight. And if the countries who have done so want to protect their investment, if they see and want to make sure that trains are a mode of transport of the future, they have to support us in making another step to the future. DAC, that is. So, the sector will finance the future by way of new builds, by investing in new builds, which come with the DACs, and the respective member states will allow us to forget about the past, to move away from the screw coupler so that going forward we have a truly viable mode of transport. So this should be our selling proposition. And if we do it that way, we stand a chance of winning, because this is clear language. This is something people can understand. We shouldn't come up with, number crunching exercises. This is how much money I need for this or that. No, DAC is a key technology. We have mentioned it 1,000 times today. DAC is a digitization project, ladies and gentlemen. It's about the fundamental question of whether or not we want to automate and digitize rail operations. Whether that's going to be, achieved by 2015 or 2025 or 2030, well, that's not so important, but we need to get there eventually. And that's also something that is communicated to us by our customers. They all agree that DAC is the unavoidable, the inevitable building block for rail operations in all over Europe. DAC can create an awful lot of capacity, at the push of one button all across Europe. And isn't that a compelling case that we should communicate to our politicians, to our political leaders? Thank you very much for, this very passionate and clear statement in favor of 100% funding. I would like to hand over that question to someone who is responsible of operational aspects. Mr. Shearing, 100% funding. What is your assessment? Well, if you put that question to me that way, I'd of course say, of course, 100%. But then we all know, and Mr. Bull will agree, that this is a hard road to hoe. It's not going to be achieved overnight, and we have learned our lessons well. We know that the DAC is the 30% enabler. We're not going to get there without deploying the DAC. There can be no doubt about that. And we know that the railway operators and the wagon keepers, like we want to invest here. We are prepared to make substantial investments. But, we won't be the only ones benefiting from it, and that's why we expect others to contribute too. Now, I'm not going to argue about 100%, You may have, this is the ultimate target level, but, I'm not going to argue about the details. Mr. Bull, what is your response to that? Can you understand where Mr. Peterhans and Mr. Shearing are coming from? Of course, I can understand your reasoning. No problem at all. And I can see, what your concerns are. Now, you are all, experienced and seasoned negotiators, and starting negotiations with a maximum demand, that's absolutely standard practice. However, from a technical point of view, I would like you to think about the following observation, which I'd like to share with you. We believe that it is in the economic interest of every company for DAC to be implemented, to be rolled out. And against that backdrop, I think it does make sense indeed that those who have an economic interest in implementing the DAC, they should also be expected to make an investment to make this happen. Don't you think that's a reasonable argument? Well, it's not recognized across the board, but it's starting to transpire that the three-pillar model is something that should be discussed. But let's stick with the 100% for the time being. Not 110, but only 100%. Now, if there are several funding pillars, the national states and Europe, who have to foot the bill, and you said so yourself, Mr. Bull, we will need a lot of convincing to do in other member states too. So they need to be convinced that DAC is a great thing. There's a group of member states, and there's a committee representing them. You are present there. There's also representatives from Switzerland and from Austria. But how can we make sure to involve the other European countries too, to make them subscribe to the DAC project? Well, that's our task to be achieved. It's great that we have this EDDP structure where not only the sector representatives and EU representatives are talking to one another, but where the EU member states are also represented. So that's a great forum. But if you look at the representation, you can clearly see which countries are represented and which countries are not yet represented. So this is where I see a task to be carried out on our part, to bring about greater representation on these committees. So we have to forge a network at a technical level involving the ministries of transport of the member states. Because, this is where the biggest success will be seen and felt. So why don't we start with the countries that are most open to this idea? And even with them, it's difficult to fully convince them. Because we started so early in Germany and, they joined the game only at a later point in time. One thing is certain, we cannot do that alone. We need other players to play along. And, imagine you reach out to a ministry in a given member state. It will certainly make sense to do this, simultaneously as you reach out to the industry stakeholders. So, in order to build a broad-based network. Do you think 10 billion euros is a lot of money? Well, of course it's a lot of money, but in Germany we're going to be able to build a almost fully operational airport for 12 billion. And we are refurbishing our opera halls, for a lot of money. In Venice, they are building a dam for 5 billion euros. And if you think about the costs associated with the floodings, which occurred last summer, I mean, it's relative, It can't be that difficult to come up with 10 billion euros in Europe. Well, as a taxpayer, I'd say that 10 billion euros is a lot of money. But if you look at the national German budget, you will see that, 10 billion is only one annual slice for the national infrastructure, a little more than 10 billion. And if you look at the EU budget, it's, just a small percentage figure. So what I want to say is that we all seem to be convinced of the introduction of the DAC, and this probably also goes for the bulk of our participants. And now we need to make sure that we move this out of the current niche, because it still is a niche in the overall budget. Now, it's helpful that there is an industrial political component. So let's, communicate that this is not only a topic with an impact on logistics. It is an impact that goes much wider, environmental issues, social issues. So it's not only a niche topic anymore. It needs to be seen for what it really is, a topic that can have a, Europe-wide impact. Now, 10 billion, that's too little. That's not good enough. That's not enough. And that's why we have to label the DAC as a political topic, as an environmental topic, as a social topic. Let's not frame it as a, pure play technical exercise. You have to, link it up with much more prominent projects. The DAC is basically the investment of a state in the future. Let's communicate it that way, because it comes with an added benefit. It makes economic sense, so let's do it. All we're asking you to do, the politicians, to stop the system of the past and try to move it into the future. So these 10 billion, won't be good enough to roll the DAC out on a broader base. We don't want to fund the future, but we want to sever the ties with the past. This is what it's all about, and that's perhaps the key question. So don't misunderstand me to say that, the EU is required to build an airport for rail operations. We're going to do that ourselves, but we have to make sure that we cut the ties that link us to past technological approaches which are not fit for the future. And I hope that, with the French EU presidency, which has only just started, I hope that the topic will move up on the agenda. And I hope that the French participants who are listening to the English stream, I hope that they will communicate the urgency of the DAC issue to their ministries, because otherwise we won't get it out of the current niche. I am quite aware of the fact that we need to work on all of the three pillars. We need national and European funding and sectoral funding, because the sector has a vested interest itself. Gilles and the other colleagues on the panel, you are quite experienced in terms of what the situation is like Europe-wide. So what is your assessment? How difficult or how easy will it be to obtain European funding? What are our prospects on that front? Well, here is how we can see this happening. The answer is we don't quite know how funding will work because, the committed funding levels, they have been placed somewhere already. And second, we don't quite know how much funding will be required at what time. So, it's pretty difficult to nail it down in concrete terms. This is how much funding will be required at a certain point in time. We cannot say that. EDGP has commissioned a study to look into the required funding model. So this will be a brainstorming exercise. It's already been started. There was a survey by the Federal Ministry of Transport. That was a good thing, but now we need to bring that to a new level, including the 3 pillars. And, I fully agree with Mr. Bull. In the final analysis, probably we are going to need to have an extraordinary funding model at a European level. And I'd like to remind you once again, let's not only look at this in terms of funding, but let's see this topic for what it really is. There needs to be some sort of a committee, a successor committee or body to the EDGP who will coordinate everything. Of course, it will have to be implemented at a national level, but still we will need European coordination, certification questions, for example. How can that be implemented unless you have a proper structure to implement things? So we may need an instrument. We had that in Switzerland when we did these noise reduction conversions, the composite brake pads when they were introduced. We found a way to pay the workshops and we found a way to pay the manufacturers. And, I can't conceive of, a central or several institutions looking after funding. We need a tool to allow for this system transformation to happen. So a structure is going to be required which will be able to work in a very transparent fashion. Are we making these kind of proposals from the EDGP, Jens? Well, what Jill said was basically about us having to, come up with a profitability analysis for the introduction of the DAC, because this will allow us to see how much concrete can be saved by not having to build new track lines. And, what does this mean in terms of CO2 consumption? We'll do that. And then we, we'll ask the European stakeholders, is this worth it? Are you prepared to invest in this business case? So once we've put together a powerful story, we're going to have to put it to the European lawmakers, and, this will make a major difference. There was something else I was going to touch upon. How can we sell this business case to the customers if, the costs might be slightly higher? Well, if we stick with the 3-pillar logic, ultimately we're going to have to recharge to the members, to the customers who may ultimately have to pay slightly more, perhaps 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 euros more than now. Well, I am surprised to hear these amounts of money, How come that our customers should know better than we how much, what the costs will be like? Well, it's a question that was put to us, sorry. I know I'm familiar with this question, and it was put to us by a forwarder, so this should surprise us. One thing is quite clear. The term enabler is not to be understood that we will manage a better modal split, but customers, and customers may be railway operators or forwarders, they have a huge lever. We will be able to put more trains on the track. The throughput times will be much shorter, and let's never forget, and we've heard that before in the different presentations, we will be able to show the transport chain in digital terms, to have a digital, representation of the transport chain, and that's certainly something that will be very interesting both for the working keepers and our customers. But even if we were to optimize throughput times by 1 or 2 days, these 3 to 4 euros that our customers may have to pay by way of additional costs, I wouldn't call it peanuts, but it's negligible, So we do have a large lever that our customers will ultimately benefit from too. By the way, we've already started reaching out to our customers, and we know that many of them are afraid. They are afraid of having to pay a higher bill, and that's why I welcome this symposium. It's an excellent starting point to give our customers information and insights into the new world that we are about to enter. But let me repeat one more time. The lever is not to be underestimated, and these additional 4 to 6 euros shouldn't worry our customers too much. That's a clear and good statement. Thank you very much. Now, probably I cannot expect any one of you to give us the percentage figures to either of the 3 pillars. Mr. Bull? No, of course not. We are still in the midst of the discussion. We need to work out a truly European concept, and we can give you the figures only once our work is done. For the time being, it's still work in progress, constantly changing. And we and EDTP will be happy to inform you once results are available. Here's one more question I'd like to put the panelists. So, it's to do with costs and benefits, but the benefits may not always be palpable where the biggest investments have to be made. Talking about the transfer models, I'd like to put the question to, all of the panelists, basically. So, transfer payments may have to be made. What do you think of that? Well, what if, the funding ends up with someone who has done, a certain number of kilometers? You know what I'm talking about? Well, we should try and break down this question and simplify it. We've learned how difficult it is to get the respective return on your investment. That's why I would like to argue in favor of a pretty straightforward funding model to make sure that the working keepers or those making the investment should be entitled to receiving the funding in return. How this will be managed in concrete terms, well, this has yet to be worked out. But experience from an earlier exercise, which is not that long ago, and we remember that the working keepers were faced with the requirement of massive investments a couple of years ago. They were given access to funding sources, and against the backdrop of this experience, I agree with Gilles, and we are aware of the fact that these investments need to be made. The transport and traffic turnaround needs to be achieved. And the 30% that you mentioned earlier is something we have to achieve. Knowing that from the 450,000 wagons, 100,000 wagons will leave, will go out of the system. I mean, how can we, cope with that, especially against the backdrop of the introduction of the DAC, which will lead to all sorts of chains and stresses. Transfer models, well, I would like to confirm what Carsten said. We don't want to repeat past experience, do we? No way. Okay. And if for each and every cent worth of funding, we lose 50% in transactional costs, then, I'm okay with the transfer models. Europe-wide, IT systems, of course, but where's the benefit? We are talking about us cutting the ties with the past. We don't want to see the screw coupler anymore. Of course, I'm putting this in a pointed fashion. In the US, they would say, hey guys, you are stupid. From an industry political point of view, why don't you scrap everything and come up with new builds? You know, that's what they propose to us when it comes to noise insulation. And we are discussing about, you know, complicated EU-based transactional models. Don't do that. Don't that. It's not a good idea. Okay, so that's not a proposal that the EDDP is going to make. Do I understand you correctly? Yes. There's one more question, which comes from VDV. What's the lead time, the preparation time for funding? So when do you have to apply for funding so that you know, are able to order your equipment? Well, that's a matter to be answered later on. I mean, you know, we cannot provide this funding from the current budgets. And, you know, this requires all sorts of upfront work. You know, stockpiling has to be done before the actual conversion starts, which has to be paid for. So from an administrative point of view, very difficult. One thing is sure, we're going to need money before the whole thing actually starts. And we're talking about gigantic amounts of money. And what about these companies, you know, that have to pay upfront without any return? And what about their shareholders? Very interesting discussion. Well, personally speaking, and I'm coming back to what I said earlier, but be that as it may, answering this question about, you know, material procurement, what about, you know, upfront funding, we will instantly get to the point that we need some sort of coordinating body to take care of that. Because, you know, having 700 companies procuring material, buying stuff, you know, from Romania, from Switzerland, from Germany, from Switzerland, being funded from different sources with wagons which may or may not be registered somewhere, with 14 tenders that they, you know, submitting to different manufacturers, whether or not several thousand couplings can be supplied, just not feasible. Let's be pragmatic. We have to be flexible. We have to, you know, use combined solutions. And for that, we need to have some sort of governing structure that allows for just that. Just like EDDP, you know, today's event is a success thanks to the existence of the EDDP. And the EDDP is a huge, you know, a European success. Had we had that, you know, at, you know, when we did the noise insulation measures, had we had something similar, we would have been much more advanced. You know, within 6 months, we would have had, you know, elaborated a European structure with more than 200 experts who deal with these issues on a daily basis. And, you know, that's something that we can be built on. Let's try and repeat past successes, and let's not focus and let's not limit ourselves on mentioning problems, but let's try and solve these problems. Fully agree. And we've got great, you know, facts and figures, documents that have been put together. So that's a good thing, and that can certainly come in handy as we try to establish a structure, as you just mentioned, Mr. Peter Hans. Now, looking at my cheat sheet and looking at the watch, well, I think that we've answered most of the questions. I don't know, Gilles, you are asking for 100% financing and 100% funding, just for the record. Great. On a more serious note, I believe it's fair to say that, you know, this three-pillar type of funding will be a good starting point. It will have to be fleshed out over time, and that should also be the message that concludes this panel, if that's okay with you, Jens. Absolutely fine. Of course, the details need to be worked out, and I would like to repeat my call again. All the ministries, all the stakeholders, please do contribute your views. It would be great, you know, to be able to reach out to those ministries who are not yet convinced of the DAC. And one more note, and Constanze did so. For those of you, ladies and gentlemen, dear participants following us on their screens, please do provide your input, your ideas, your contributions are key, because everybody is free to make contribution, and the more input we have, the better will it be for everybody, for all of us. There's plenty of space, plenty of empty positions on the teams and the committees that we need to put together. So once again, if there's anybody amongst you who would like to join one of the working groups, especially the finance and funding working group, we would be more than happy to have your contributions. Of course, and I can only repeat, it is a sector-based effort, and active contribution of everybody is required. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the end of the panel. I would like to thank all of you who have made this conference a success, the speakers, the colleagues on the VPI Executive Board. Thank you very much for keeping everything running and for allowing this event to happen in the first place. I'm very sorry once again to say that we have had to have this as an online event. I would have liked to welcome you in great numbers, because personal exchange in between the breaks is so important. Hopefully we can repeat that next time around. Two more things I'd like to share with you. We've received questions via the chat. We haven't been able to take these questions. It was not designed to be an interactive meeting, but let me assure you that all questions will be collected and be published on the VPI and EDTP website. Political statements on funding, etc. Of course, we're not going to publish them, Mr. Bohr, but we will limit our publications on the technical aspects. So we will record your questions from the chat. Please give us some time, but I think it's a fair guess to say that in 14 days or so you will be able to get these questions. Also, if you feel like watching the event over again, you can do so on our YouTube channel. It will be published on the VPI YouTube channel, where you will have the opportunity to listen to everything that's been said and heard here, just in case you weren't able to follow the meeting today. Apart from that, I hope that we have covered the key issues concerning all of us. I believe it's fair to say that all those of you have stayed with us, for the past 4 hours. You will leave this meeting wiser and more knowledgeable than before. I also believe that this format should be rolled out Europe-wide, because, the kind of information that was shared here today concerns everybody who's interested in the DAC. Very happy to be able to host this conference, and hopefully we'll be able to keep up the splendid cooperation, because all of our member associations are very much involved. And one more time, I'd like to repeat my call that this is not an inner circle who's dealing with the DAC, even though we are addressing, one another on a first-name basis. It's not just a couple of friends talking about the DAC. It's a sector-based approach. It's the chance for rail-based traffic to move more cargo to the rail. It has an environmental impact contributing to the CO2 footprint, to the Green Deal. Let's move in the same direction, all of us together. So if you want to join this effort, please get in touch with the EDTP, with the VPI, and we will put you in touch with the relevant people. On that note, I'd like to conclude the conference. Looking at you, Jens, once again, what about you? A number of famous last words.
I'd also like to express thanks of Mark Mutcherley, the other head program manager who can't be here today, but who just as much appreciates here. And I believe that this is an event that we have to multiply. This is exactly the communication that we need with regards to these topics. This will move us forward. So I'd like to say a big thank you to Martin and the VPI. Jill also said that there's also translation into English. So we also pay tribute to the international aspect. So give us a fortnight and then you can read up everything. And I think on our YouTube channel it will be available in 3 or 4 days. So thank you very much for having us. Thank you very much to the speakers. Stay well, and I hope that we will meet each other in person again very soon. Thank you.